So the assertiveness spectrum is a way to gauge the relational modalities that you're using in your interactions. This is actually for work or personal relationships, and to be conscious of the ways that you're interacting with the people around you. So the assertiveness spectrum, not surprisingly, is a spectrum. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll find passivity. Passivity is basically kind of loosely described as an extreme need for safety. When we're being passive, we are often submissive. When we're being passive, we engage in a lot of abdication, thinking, and behavior. We basically look for ways to get out, get away, these types of things. And the leadership circle people teach us that passivity has the highest negative leadership effectiveness correlation. So if you're a leader and you're passive, you're going to run into problems. So on the one side, we have passivity. Now, if we go completely to the other side of the assertiveness spectrum, we find aggression. Now, aggression can be loosely described as an extreme need to dominate. When we're in the aggressive mode, when we're being aggressive, oftentimes we'll use intimidation. We'll tend to think and behave in domineering ways, and in its most extreme form, will actually become violent. It's helpful to understand that when you get far enough to either end of the spectrum, these relational modalities start to have things in common. Now, if we look at aggression and we think of hypercontrol, it's pretty obvious, but we don't think of passivity as being controlling or control-based a relational modality, but actually it's quite controlling. You can control a lot, control the people around you when you use passivity. And if you see someone being aggressive, chances are there's something that's scaring them. It's helpful to understand that both aggression and passivity are fear-based, hypercontrol-based relational modalities. And that brings us to the assertiveness relational modality, which of course is considered the go-to or default relational modality in most circumstances, and rightly so. Assertiveness can be loosely described as being in a state of mind and a state of being in which you are able to state your position. You'll know your position, you'll be clear about your position, you'll be clear about where you stand, and there'll be a certain kind of ego strength to it, certain groundedness to it. However, there will also be an elevated ability to listen. When we're in assertiveness, we can allow other people to state their case, and we'll be able to listen. And when we say that, we mean active listening. So you allow space for others' position, other people's opinion, other people's style and timing. But most of all, in assertiveness, we allow the dialectic to impact us. We allow things to come in and change our point of view. We allow things to help us shift our opinion. The dialectic is basically thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. So something comes in, you're with your position, you have your base and your thinking, and you allow something to come in and affect that, and then you're off to a third thing. That's what we consider having a strong enough ego to allow the dialectic to affect you, to allow the dialectic to impact you. When people are being assertive, that's when you're more likely to get collaboration, teamwork, and partnership. And the components of assertiveness are courage to be vulnerable. Obviously, if you're going to be assertive, you have to put yourself out there. The maturity to accept that you don't have control. So it takes maturity to understand that you might not necessarily get your way. And then trust for the self. Often when we mention trust, people think we mean trust for the people around you or trust for the circumstance or the dynamic. And oftentimes, to be assertive, you have to trust yourself. You have to know that you'll be okay, even if you put yourself out there and it doesn't go your way. So assertiveness is a passion-based potential catalyst. It's when we're being assertive, in the truest sense of the word, we make space for the potential of other living systems, teams, divisions, organizations, but most of all the other human beings around us. We create potential for those, space for the potential of others to unfold. But it's a passion-based relational modality. When we're in the assertive relational modality, we're passionate enough to put ourselves out there, courageous enough to allow others to impact us and make space for other people as well. So that brings us to the zone of effectiveness. Now, the zone of effectiveness is assertiveness, but also includes two of the subcategories related to assertiveness or near assertiveness on the assertiveness spectrum. We still consider those to be included in the default relational modalities for functional relationships and functional organizational cultures. Important to know that if you step out of this zone of effectiveness and you are in a functional relationship or a relationship that you aspire to be functional, you will run into problems generally. So the two subcategories of assertiveness are strategic assertiveness, and decisive assertiveness. Now let's look at those one at a time. Strategic assertiveness is basically packaging your approach. So you're spinning something or you're selling something, but we're in the zone of effectiveness, so it's still a version or a component of assertiveness. So we bring others with us. We don't leave others behind. So there's an inclusiveness to it. So we get that inclusiveness through transparency. So when you're using strategic assertiveness, you will spin or sell what you're trying to push forward, but you'll be transparent about doing it. Oftentimes we're talking about in a relationship or in a team. When we're in strategic assertiveness, we will tend to accentuate the positives and downplay the negatives. Now, decisive assertiveness is basically to respectfully drive or push your approach forward. And once again, when we're in the assertiveness mode, we're careful to be inclusive. So we bring others with us. We include others. And once again, that implies transparency. So if you're being decisive and you're pushing something forward in a team, let's say, you would say, hey, everybody, I'm going to push this forward because it's really important to me, and this is why it's important to me. So when we're in decisive assertiveness, we are basically advocating something in order to steer something in a certain direction, and we will tend to state imperatives and state the cost of inaction. So that's the zone of effectiveness, and it's important to remember when we're in the zone of effectiveness, we retain inclusivity. So we generally do that through transparency. There's a lot of active listening that goes on. Others' opinions, input, style, timing, and so on are space is made for that, so that's included. And then once again, we allow other positions, other opinions, other style to impact us. We call that the dialectic. We allow the dialectic to impact us. Now, when we step out of the zone of effectiveness, and once again, it's really important to understand that when we step out of the zone of effectiveness and we are in a functional relationship or a functional organizational culture, we will cause problems. It's important to know that. So if you go into manipulative, which is the next modality, the next relational modality on the passive side, we step into being manipulative, you better have a reason, you better be conscious that you're doing it, and be conscious of the reasons why you're doing it. So manipulative on the passive side of the assertiveness spectrum is basically a need for stealth. So we start to be sneaky or tricky. We tend to use back channel communication, being sneaky, of course. We're still in the game. We're still engaged, but we tend to navigate covertly when we're being manipulative. And then ultimately, we're objectifying the other living systems around us. We're objectifying the team, the organization, the division, and most of all, we're objectifying the other human beings around us. The people around us become tools or obstacles to what we're trying to achieve. Now, if we go one more iteration toward extreme passivity, we end up in something we call avoidant. Avoidant is an elevated need for safety, a reluctance to engage, so we start to disengage. A reluctance to get involved in anything that requires risk. Decision making becomes extremely conservative because decision making by its nature tends to be risky. And instead of navigating covertly, we start to circumnavigate. We start to check out. We start to withdraw. Now, if we go to the other side of the spectrum and we step out of the zone of effectiveness, and once again, when we're out of the zone of effectiveness, it's very important to understand we better have a reason why. We better be conscious that we're doing it because in functional relationships and functional organizational cultures outside of the zone of effectiveness will tend to cause trouble. Now, to the aggressive side of the assertiveness spectrum, when we get one iteration toward aggression from decisive, we end up in something we call controlling, the controlling relational modality. When we're in the controlling relational modality, our ego needs will tend to be met with control. We'll start to fail to delegate if we're in a leadership position. We'll tend to resist input. We'll tend to control others just for the sake of control. So it tends to start to be about our own safety, our own needs. Now, one more iteration toward aggression, and we find ourselves in the commanding relational modality, which is loosely described as an elevated need to dominate. Unilateral decision making starts to happen here. We expect compliance. If there's any dissent, we punish that dissent. So it starts to be more of an iron fist type of interaction, but not quite yet extreme aggression. Now, the way to use this material when we're applying it to interactions that we're having, or let's say we're helping someone else use this material, typically what I'll do is I'll ask somebody, what's your typical approach? What do you typically do? Or when you go into this circumstance next week or next month or whatever, how do you suppose that you'll enter the circumstance on the spectrum? And typically someone will say something like, well, I know myself pretty well. I'll probably be between strategic and manipulative. I can be kind of manipulative. And I say, okay, great. And that becomes a discussion. And we want to use this material to help people understand and create their own solutions rather than telling them what to do necessarily. And then, of course, I ask them to speculate, are there other places on the spectrum that might be more advantageous? And they might say, well, I might maybe just decisive would be better, or to be controlling or whatever, but that becomes a discussion. And then we find ourselves in the secondary question, and that is, what kind of response do you think you'll get? Now, typically, this material is used in relationships, business relationships, personal relationships, social relationships. And so the question is how do you think the other person is going to show up? Where will they be on the spectrum? Basically do is take the assertiveness spectrum and I flip it upside down. And then I ask them, where do you think the other person will be on that spectrum when they come into the room, or when they come into the meeting, or when you sit down to dinner with them, or whatever? For instance, someone might say, oh, that's my CFO. He's going to show up. He's a very manipulative person. I go, okay, great. Let's talk about that. If that person shows up manipulative, is that a problem for you, considering where you will show up on the assertiveness spectrum? And because he's liable to show up manipulative, should you be somewhere else on the spectrum and when you show up? And that becomes a discussion, and then we talk about that. And then I will ask, well, let's just assume this person doesn't show up manipulative. Let's say they show up decisive or controlling or whatever. What would you do then? So we start to speculate about where they might want to consider these other places that they could be, or other places they might have to be.